On March 23, 1900, Joseph Letminsky, a worker for the Newburgh American Steel and Wire Company, lay bleeding on the floor, motionless, assumed dead, but he only looked dead. Doctors at St. Alexis Hospital removed an 1.5 inch piece of shattered bone from his frontal lobe. Life as he knew it was lost. This is a story of loss, not a story of one person, but everyone who has suffered a work injury. This is not a story of today, but a story of history. This is a story of conflict and compromise. This is a story of workers' compensation.
The Industrial Revolution, which began in Europe, reached the shores of the United States, a nation recovering from the conflict of civil war. Radical Reconstruction and the New South would be fueled by industry. The new factories had dangerous machinery, a jumble of belts, pulleys, and gears. State labor reports reflected tragedies and grisly accidents, and those reports included other Joseph Letminskys.
Greed was a child of the Gilded Age, born from the huddled masses arriving. Americans were also on the move, leaving farms for cities. Once, family farms had provided shelter and security for any injured family member. Now these cities, sweltering sweatshops, provided neither, providing only despair, disability, or death. The price is to be paid for the fruits of the Industrial Revolution.
As the scales of justice tipped in favor of the workers, and states began bowing to the pressure of organized labor, jury awards to workers increased. To avoid financial ruin, companies took out expensive employers' liability insurance. According to economist Price Fishback,
Maryland, Montana, and New York experimented with workers' compensation, but flaws in the laws led judges to declare them unconstitutional, and neither business nor labor were ready for compromise yet.
The Progressive Era brought reform. In 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt pointed out to Congress,
"The burden of an accident falls upon the helpless man, his wife, and children. We need an act providing compensation to all employees."
So the federal government took the lead in providing government workers with protection for on-the-job injuries. The Federal Employers' Liability Act of 1908 was passed.
in 1910, muckraker William B. Hard published Making Steel and Killing Men. Hard stated,
Every year, out of 10,000 workers, 1,200 are killed or seriously injured. One man was roasted alive when the giant vat carrying the molten steel tipped from its overhead support, spilling its liquid fire. One man was dragged into machinery. His head was severed. Both legs were cut off. Before the machinery could be stopped, he had been literally chopped to pieces. When a man was killed on the job, there was only one chance in 5 that the company would ever have to pay compensation to his survivors.
Also in 1910, political activist and lawyer Crystal Eastman published Work Accidents and the Law. Her report outlined compromises to decades-old conflicts. Eastman's compromise suggested,
If employers had an economic incentive to eliminate workplace hazards, they would do so.
The plan won support from both business and labor.
In 1911, Wisconsin was the first state to adopt a workmen's compensation law. Conflicts arose between organized labor and business over the no-fault clause, which compromised the workers' right to sue. The employers lobbied the state legislators for what is now known as the Great Trade-Off. The director of the United States Department of Labor, Shelby Hallmark, describes it best.
The biggest conflicts, basic essence of workers' comp is that there's supposed to be a trade-off between the employer and the employee. Nature of workers' comp is a compromise whereby employee community gave up the right to sue and get big tort liability judgments when they're injured at work. They gave up that right in return for smaller but hopefully theoretically reliable and prompt workers' comp payments. That's the nature of the compromise of workers' compensation.
Over the next few years, in state after state, compromises between workers, employers, and unions were made. By 1949, all states had legislated some form of workers' compensation.
Details of the plan vary from state to state, but as a rule, there are 3 general benefits. First, the employer gets tort relief. Second, the injured worker receives compensation, usually 2/3 of their salary for the period of disability, or in the form of a lump sum for any permanent partial disability. Finally, employers must pay for the worker's medical and rehabilitation costs. More benefits for workers mean lower wages, but this is a compromise that leads to better medical benefits.
As the world endures conflicts of its own, the Great War, World War II, the Cold War, and compromises and treaties were made, improvements to workmen's compensation remained stagnant. Professor Alan Derrickson states,
Between 1911 and 1970, workers' compensation benefits did not keep up with inflation.
The 70s did bring change not only to the name, which became more gender-friendly and was now called workers' compensation. On December 29, 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the William Steiger Occupational Safety and Health Act, or OSHA, giving the federal government the authority to set and enforce safety and health standards for most of the country's workers.
OSHA also established the National Commission on State Workmen's Compensation Laws, which submitted its report in 1972. The commission, which I chaired, recommended improvements in state laws. In response to the report, many states expanded coverage and increased benefits. Most of these changes are included in today's workers' compensation laws.
This program comes with a price, not only in monetary terms, but also in human terms. Over 16,000 workplace injuries or illness occur each day in the United States. Almost 6,000 workplace deaths occur within the U.S. every year. Over $40 billion are paid to families of accident victims each year. Despite the financial safety net for the worker, the conflicts and compromises still continue. According to Richard Victor, Executive Director of the Workers' Compensation Research Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts,
there's conflict and compromise at 2 levels. One is, what should the system look like? The conflict and compromise that happens in all the state legislatures. And there, I think the biggest conflicts and compromises historically were, should employers be responsible for all injuries regardless of whether they were at fault or not? I think you made an insightful choice, because workers' compensation at its core is a compromise that came out of conflicts.
Despite the still staggering numbers of injuries and their cost, workers' compensation has changed history and the nature of the workplace in the United States. It was the first widespread social insurance program in U.S. history. According to economist Price Fishback,
well, you know, workers' compensation was based on a series of compromises. Insurance companies made money by selling more policies. Employers escaped lawsuits, and they managed to pass some of those costs on to workers. And finally, workers, even if they paid some of those costs, benefited from better insurance and more financial assistance.
Over the past 80 years, benefits have improved. All states now cover occupational and workplace diseases, but there are still conflicts. According to Richard Victor of the Workers' Compensation Institute,
today, the biggest conflicts and compromises have to do with 2 things. One is, who controls the choice of the doctor? And the second is, for workers who are injured and they're able to go back to work, but physically they're not fully healed, how much money should they get? Those are the 2 biggest conflicts and compromises.
As long as there are lawyers, workers, and accidents, this story of conflict and compromise will continue, and so will the great trade-off.